This video will continue the outline of the superego's formation. The mechanism underlying the harshness and destructiveness of this psychic agency will be especially emphasized. The distinction between moral and ideal function is especially illustrated in the differences that Freud established between feelings of guilt and feelings of inferiority. These two feelings are the result of a tension between the ego and the superego. The former has to do with what is allowed and what is prohibited, and the latter with its goals the subject did or did not accomplish. The superego corresponds to the authority, and the ego ideal to the way in which the subject behaves in order to respond to what the authority expects. The ego ideal is a model to which the subject tries to adapt. Some authors further distinguished two components within the ideal segment of the superego in Freud's theory. These are the ideal ego, which has an internal origin related to childhood narcissism, and the ego ideal, which draws its existence collectively, namely from culture, family values, and ideals introjected as a model. Freud first talked about the ideal ego in his paper Introduction to Narcissism, where he wrote that through the ideal ego, the subject tries to individually reconquer the so-called state of omnipotence, of infantile narcissism. In the ideal ego, there is no distance between the ego and the ideal. The subject wants the things now and puts into operation the desires of the id and wants to fulfill them immediately. From this viewpoint, the purified pleasure ego is a formation of the ideal ego, insofar as it identifies the pleasant with the ego and the unpleasant with external reality. The external influences. The use of the term identification in Freudian theory underwent important changes over time. Freud used this word in his first case histories in a more descriptive way as a synonym of imitation, a sort of being like somebody else. For example, his patient Dora imitated Mrs. K, identifying with her through the symptom of coughing. Later, from the 1920s, Freud started to use the term identification in a different and more conceptual way. It became the result of the mechanism of introjection, through which external objects are taken into the ego and established as a gradient within it. In this way, the object cathexes are abandoned and replaced by identification. The libidinal tendencies linked to the Oedipus complex are partly desexualized, and the authority of the parents is introjected into the ego, thus forming the nucleus of the superego. Freud wrote that when the ego assumes the features of the object, it tries to mend the id's loss. In a certain sense, it is as if the ego is telling the id, "Look, you can love me too. I am so like the object." The mechanism underlying the identification that leads to the formation of the superego resembles that of the melancholic identification. As we saw in the video related to the ego's formation, the melancholic identification has a narcissistic character, which depends on the return to the ego of the object cathexis. On the contrary, in the hysterical identification of Freud's first cases, the object's charge is maintained and, therefore, the subject does not identify with the object, but with some features of it. Therefore, the latter remains independent of the subject who keeps cathecting it. In reality, there is something paradoxical in this identification, because we keep the object and, therefore, we identify with elements of others that remain outside of us. The harshness of the superego. While one's own norms, which constitute one's character, are mostly self-thintonic, the norms of the superego, namely the interiorized norms imposed by parents and external authorities, are lived as alien to the ego and therefore as strongly self-dystonic. Impositions, norms of behavior, and moral standards prescribed by the superego are often felt by people as strict and harsh laws difficult to comply with. Why our moral consciousness is so strict. In regards to the severity of the superego, Freud followed two complementary lines of thought. Once again, these lines of thought follow both internal and external influences. According to the latter, the characteristics of the superego embody the severity of the real father or parents by repeating his or their prohibitions and commands. As for the former hypothesis, in the second Freudian drive dualism, the severity of the superego originates as the result of the destructive impulses of the subject exerted against the ego. Later, in his paper Civilization and its Discontent, Freud wrote that in the formation of the superego, both constitutional factors and external influences from the environment act in a combination, so that the severity of the superego, which a child develops, in no way corresponds to the severity of treatment which he has himself met with. So where does this demanding role of the superego come from, if the education that a child received is not the only factor? In enunciating his final drive theory, Freud used the terms fusion and diffusion of drives. Through this concept, he meant that libido and death drive never present themselves in pure form, but that they are always mixed together in variable proportions. On the one hand, he described the death drive as a constitutional tendency of organic matter to disintegrate the organisms and conduct them to a state of inorganic stability. On the other hand, he conceived the libido as a force that strives to unify and aims at forming bigger unities. This force also tries to unify and fuse together the two fundamental drives themselves, thus making the destructive drive innocuous. Fusion and amalgamation of drives only occurs in varying proportions, so that we never deal with pure libido or pure death drive, but only with combinations of them. However, under certain conditions, a diffusion can take place. One of these circumstances is the introjection into the ego of the first objects of the id's impulses, namely the two parents. In this process, which leads to identification, the libido is diverted from its direct sexual aims so that the relation to those objects is desexualized. Libido is used to carry out the identificatory process through the settlement in the ego of the external parental objects. As a consequence, the occurrence of the identification brings about drive diffusion. The death drive is thus freed from the yoke of the libido and is used by the superego to attack the ego through the reproaches of the moral conscience. From this disassociation or diffusion of drives, the superego reveals its cruel duty of imperative and rigorous character.